If your team's trying to move faster with AI or scale more efficiently without reinventing the wheel, InfoQ Dev Summit Munich 2025 this October 15th and 16th might help. It's a practical event, talks from people in the trenches, sharing what they've actually shipped, fixed, or learned. No big launches or buzzwords, just useful ideas you can take back to your team the next day. Learn more at devsummit.infoq.com.
Hello everybody, I'm InfoQ Pop, and I have in front of me Luca Mezzalira, one of the forefathers of Microfrontends. Without any further ado, Luca, please give us an introduction of yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you very much for having me in this episode of InfoQ Podcasts. So I'm very excited about sharing quite a few stuff around Microfrontends. My name is Luca Mezzalira. I'm a serverless specialist solution architect working for AWS at the moment. And in the past 10 years, I started to rationalize how microfrontends or better distributed system for frontend are working and how it should be implemented. Hence why I have delivered several talks worldwide. I wrote a couple of editions of Building Microfrontends book and trying to contribute as much as possible to the community with, let's say, some specific patterns that we have implemented over the last few years, like the discovery pattern and many others.
Thank you, Luca. So looking at your presentation, it was like a nice aha moment. I have to admit I'm a backend guy, and one of the benefits of generative AI is that I finally can have something that looks decent. Well, probably it's full of holes and everything like that, but for now it looks great. You wrote the Microfrontend books quite some time ago, and now you're writing your second book. What changed in the meantime? The ecosystem, how did it mature? Tell us your takes on this period.
Absolutely. So the first edition was released in end of 2021, early 2022, basically. And I started to write it in 2019. So that at least collocate when the findings were at the beginning, when I started 10 years ago, there weren't documentation or let's say many examples that would lead me to define an architecture. So I basically took the microservices implementation that was very well explained by different people like Sam Newman or Neil Ford or many others. And I started to apply the principles behind into the front end and adapting obviously for the front end part because it's different from backend, right? Since then, when I wrote the first edition, there were just a few companies embracing this approach. And a few of them are quite well known. Like back in the days, there was Microsoft, there was PayPal, there was Zalando, that is a fashion e-commerce, Fever, and many others that tried to do the first implementation of microfrontends. But the community was quite immature, mainly because it was a new topic. And up to that point, we always worked building monolithic front-end application despite we had microservices on the backend. So during my time at The Zone, that is a live sports streaming platform, I basically mastered this idea of microfrontends and trying to create vocabulary around that, creating patterns and identify antipatterns that were basically the culprit of our development. In fact, we use microfrontends across our applications and we work in different devices, not only web applications. And since then, to be honest, I moved role into AWS and I was able to help hundreds of teams worldwide from New Zealand to Silicon Valley migrating towards microfrontends. And what I have discovered during this year, and that's also the reason why I wanted to write a second edition of the book, was that many of the patterns and anti-patterns that I have gathered during the previous years were common across multiple companies. But then I started to refine them and started to see commonalities across different industries, projects that I follow from B2B to e-commerce, retailers, stuff like that. So I started to realize that there was more and provide more heuristics for people to embrace properly this approach, because everything boiled down to identify the role of platform engineering. For instance, at the beginning was more, let's say, loose to a certain extent in the first edition, because I tried to cover the things that I believe were important, like automation pipeline, how to think about that, deployment, etc. But I think in this new edition, I cover way more with way more opinion. And plus, the ecosystem changed drastically. In fact, Vercel, Astro, and many other well-known frameworks nowadays are starting to wire towards the microfrontends approach. I remember React with React 17 embraced the idea of the possibility to have multiple React versions inside the same virtual DOM. That is interesting because at the beginning they were reluctant to do that. Nowadays, it's normal having React available into having Microfrontends with React available. There were a lack of tools at the beginning in 2021. Nowadays, we have plenty of tools that enables people to build Microfrontends properly. Recently, there was, let's say, a new version of Module Federation and Single SPA that are two of the main frameworks, I would say, for building Microfrontends on the client-side rendering. For server-side rendering, we had Vercel that did a huge investment in the last year and a half, building Microfrontends as a first-class primitive inside their platform, and also democratize several of the challenges that we have experienced in Microfrontends to their customers. And not only that, I think the direction of travel is getting more interesting with this acknowledgement that there is a strong need of distributed system on front end. And funny enough, to be honest with you, another thing that I notice in the architecture space that makes me extremely happy is that after the, let's say, announcement or the introduction of microservices back in the early 2000s, more or less at the same time when I was starting to talk about microfrontends globally, also data mesh came along. So there was a need for different layers of the system to be distributed, because we realized that with distributed teams, we can achieve more and work in parallel. And if we design properly our system, we can work independently. And this is something that I witnessed firsthand with several of the AWS customers, as well as with, let's say, companies that have followed, where teams started to be independent despite they were cross-functional component aligned. And I think is a testimony of the good job that the Microfrontends community have done over the years, where we started to be more present in different conferences, inspire people, provide documentation, provide examples, simplify the development and the developer experience, specifically for developers, abstracting certain concepts that before were, let's say, custom for each implementation, and nowadays became a commodity that I think is something that we have experienced a lot also in the cloud, if you think about that.
Nice. So let me try to put that in a nutshell. During this period of, let's say, 4 to 5 years since the first edition of the book came across, the ecosystem matured. And we don't have to speak only about the micro frontends per se, because they are part of a bigger picture. And the whole distributed mindset moved, probably, let's say that it grew more from that perspective, because we don't have only microservices, we don't have only micro frontends, but we're discussing about data mesh, and the concept of distribution in software architecture is becoming more interconnected with the way how we build also teams. So that means that distribution and autonomy are the points moving forward from that perspective. Would that sum up what would be the message?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I think it's important to realize that if you remember, we are old enough to remember the time when, I don't know, a small team of 3, 4, 5 people, you can build end-to-end the system that might not be the most advanced one, but I remember building e-commerce with 2, 3 people, or I don't know, software inside embedded devices with a couple of people. So I think that time has changed because the requests from our customers and consumers are completely different. And also the complexity around all the different aspects that compose a software has changed. And therefore, we need to have multiple people working in the same social technical system. And in order to do that, we cannot use the approaches that we were using in the past with the monolithic end-to-end system. We need the level of modularity and granularity that has to be expressed across the system in order to make our teams, let's say, moving fast towards the release process.
Thank you. I have to say that even though I saw multiple presentations, also the recordings from QCon, yours remained in a nice place. And the main reason for that is that you found a way to speak the hands-on approach, even though looking at points, higher level concepts. And the heuristics were probably the nicest thing that people would like to, because it's, people are using analogies, and now you're putting in place these nice things, the best tools for developers. But we all know that usually we don't get a greenfield. Not most of us don't receive a greenfield. So then I was thinking, how should we as developers, as architects, whatever, as technical people, look at our application with a critical eye and see if we are in a good place or not? How would you suggest looking at that? What would be a checklist, a heuristic to do that?
So first and foremost, I would start, do you really need microfrontends? Sometimes, I've seen very often trends coming in, especially in the front end community, and people jump into these trends straight away without asking themselves if it's really needed. Because, the moment that you move towards a distributed system is a completely different situation for several layers or dimensions inside the company to take into account. So that's the first thing that I would assess. And usually everything boils down on the number of people that are working the same project, or if you are working on a multi-tenancy system where a part of the system is fully standard, like if you think about the sign in, sign up of a project, and then you have a part of customization. Therefore, even with small teams of less than 20 people, you can have some good benefit from microfrontends, in my opinion. That is probably the first thing that I will look at. So in case that you decide that microfrontends are the way to go, then we need to look into how to slice the monolithic system. So there are a couple of recommendations that I usually provide when we are talking about that. So first and foremost, many people and many teams and companies ask me if we need to have microservices in order to work with microfrontends. But in reality, not in my experience. Because at the end of the day, we are consuming an API, right? So the API, it doesn't really matter for the front end if it's coming from a single API gateway or multiple API gateways, microservices, there is monolith. It doesn't really matter. The contract is what really matters. You want to use GraphQL because currently you have GraphQL. Go for it. You want to use REST, go for it. One data point that is interesting in my experience of the last few years is that every time that the company start to look into modernizing through microservices and microfrontends, the migration or modernization towards microfrontends takes between a third or a half of the time compared to microservices, if not even more sometimes. Because if you think about that, data has gravity. And therefore, we don't have on the microfrontend side to think about, okay, so we need to take this massive table or this database, Mongoose database, and split it in smaller and decide if it's SQL, no SQL, graph database, or vector, whatever. In front end is by far easier starting with, and then you can cascade that decision towards the back end or work in parallel, depends from the capacity of a company. The other interesting thing that I noticed, so if we say we need just an API, that at the beginning could be even what you have right now without massive changes. Maybe there are some tweaks that are needed, but nothing too crazy. You can start to work on the front end side. And usually my recommendation is starting from a more coarse grain approach. I created this mental model called the decision framework, where I say that the first thing that you need to understand is identifying microfrontends. So either you can have a single microfrontend that is loaded per time, that is a representation of a single view or multiple views, or it could be multiple microfrontends at the same time. Majority of the time, companies are starting with a vertical split. So having one single microfrontend loaded because it's easy to resonate, it's easier to assign and find boundaries. And the real challenge is only finding data points that enables you to say, okay, we are going to slice in this way. My recommendation in this situation is usually try to understand how your users are using your application. When I started, for instance, in my previous company to rationalize how we could slice the application in microfrontends, I identified the certain patterns that were happening inside the application. So I also described them in the book. Like, imagine that you have a million of requests coming to the landing page, but that there was a drop between a landing page and the sign in and sign up experience. And if you were a authenticated user, you didn't pass through the landing page or the sign in or sign up page. You just went straight into the catalog of the live video streaming catalog, right? And that was fantastic because usually microfrontends, what you do is loading what is called an application shell first that can understand if your user is logged in or not. It's very generic as a logic, and then can redirect the user towards the right page, either if there is a deep link, checking if the user can get access to that specific area of the website, or if the user is already authenticated, just refresh the token and make sure that they can access the authenticated area. And I think this approach is pretty interesting. So when we have understood how to split the application, the first step is understanding how to route towards a microfrontend application. Now, very often people are afraid to starting a modernization because they might think, oh, now I need to go to the management, ask for 24 months for rewriting everything with the latest version of front-end framework, and then slowly but steadily building everything while I need to keep the lights on, adding new feature in the monolith, and then migrate finally on the other side. But with Microfrontends, because we are splitting up the system in different chunks, it becomes easier to do the migration also, and also generate value for your customer and business. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine that you understand that one of the key elements of your system is the catalog of your application. The catalog usually for, let's assume an e-commerce that everyone has at least one experience with an e-commerce. Let's assume that in this e-commerce, you have like a variety of categories, and you can have like furnitures, and then you have toys and other stuff, right? So you don't have to go all in and say, okay, we need to recreate the entire catalog and then deploy and see if it works. You can take a subset of the system. You can start very easily with one small category that could be toys maybe, and build the application for that and create a microfrontend for that. And then leverage the URL for entering that specific endpoint to, let's say, maintain at the beginning the old catalog alongside, or the old application alongside with the new microfrontend one, and then understand what works, what doesn't. If there are, issues, you can roll back very quickly, because at the end of the day, it's just a DNS change that you need to redirect towards, again, back to the monolith. And this approach, combined with the vertical split, where you have like one single view, group of view deployed together, enables you to very quickly have results and understand how the system works end to end. Because the reality in a distributed system now, you don't have anymore a team that maybe thinks about the CI/CD once and forget about that. Now you have a constant iteration through that. And you always help people to really, let's say, understand how the observability works, that maybe they didn't spend too much time, while in Microfrontends is extremely important because you need to understand what's going on in production when problems arise. At the same time, you need also to understand how the development experience looks like, because now it's different, right? So you have way less to build, way less tests to think about, but at the same time, you need to have touching points with other teams that before you didn't have, how to update dependency and stuff like that. I think all these concerns will be, let's say, addressed during this iterative approach that we're going to take, because we are taking one path per time, if you want. And slowly but steadily, I've seen many customers implementing with this recommendation their microfrontends approach, and they were using for the routing part a bit of compute on the edge in wherever CDN they were using. And nowadays, every CDN I can think of, they have a bit of compute that can be leveraged on the edge. And this is great, because if you start to write the routing logic on the edge, it means that you don't have to pollute the code of the microfrontend or the monolith. That means less to change and less to test. And this is only the entry point that you have. And vast majority of the time nowadays, every single web application, either server-side rendering or client-side rendering, is front-faced with the content delivery network. Therefore, it becomes quite easy to approach in this way without polluting the code that you're going to have. And this is something that worked at scale with several companies, adding a lot of value, because I can understand that you don't want to go all in with a 24-month project without having any benefit immediately. This also is used with some companies for migrating from an older version of framework to another version of the framework, because this nature of slicing iteratively your application without the need of ending up with a microfrontend could be very helpful. Because if I move from, an old version of Angular to a new version of Angular, I can take one chunk, one URL or endpoint, and then slowly but steadily adding more stuff in the new Angular application that is monolith or microfrontend. Doesn't really matter. But I had customers that have done both successfully. And I think this approach should become more ingrained into the front end community, because very often, I take inspiration and patterns from the back end, and those are stuff that we were doing for 20 years, more or less. And the front end is still new, and sometimes it's a struggle to make people understanding that those can be easily implemented without too much burden.
Thank you. Usually when discussing about front end, one of the things was how heterogeneous the ecosystem was. Probably since we started our conversation, at least 2 or 4 new front-end frameworks appeared in the meantime, either .js or .ts, and that was moving quite fast. And as you said, people were embracing them blindly at point. Then, as you touched on a couple of points, is obviously in the backend we have more visibility. Nowadays, I'm just thinking now about Sam Newman's presentation, and when he was saying is okay, how do you pick the proper retry mechanism or the number of retries that you want to have? What's the timeout? What can we learn when we're discussing about micro frontends? As you mentioned, you're discussing about how does your customer behave? What kind of tangible metrics can we use and how to implement it? Observability is obviously important these days. What can we put in place off the bat? Because that will definitely help us move the discussion with more visibility.
Indeed. I think we need to tackle this question in two areas. So one is how we are going to split microfrontends. And I think there are two dimensions that has to take into account. The first one, as I mentioned before, how it uses your project. Because sometimes, we think that, and I've seen that a few times, that the user is doing the thing in a certain way. And this may be some assumption that product managers has, while in reality, they are using your tool differently. So that's the first thing to take into account. The second one is how your organization is structured, because we all know about Conway's law. And therefore, we know that we need to design an architecture that enables our organization structure to move and to deliver what is needed. And sometimes, you can decide to design first the architecture and then rearrange the organization structure for enabling the architecture to shine. And sometimes you cannot. And therefore, you need to design an architecture that mirror what you have currently inside the trenches. And I think this is a very important point that very often is underestimated, because architecture and the organization structure, as well as engineering culture, are three dimensions that are tightly coupled. So either you like or not, you can intentionally or accidentally touch one of those dimensions, and that will be affected badly or positively based on your decision. And if you do, obviously accidentally, it's a high risk that then any decision will generate friction inside your organization, because it's not seen as a social technical system, but more like a technical system. And that is a big problem, in my opinion. So on the other side, when we talk about observability, there are several tools that can help you to understand how things are working. So think about, for instance, Sentry or LogRockets or even New Relic. And I think nowadays, majority of the observability tools that are used for backend APIs might have an offering for the front end as well. And there you can understand, obviously, logs are important, but also core web vitals is another key metrics that we care about on the front end to understand, especially for server-side rendering, how the application works, if they take into account with the right standards and so on. But I believe first and foremost, the key things is understanding logs and volume of traffic, obviously, into your system, to understand what to cache and what not to cache. And all these things should be set up at the beginning of the first deployment of microfrontends, because those are definitely some key elements that composes a microfrontends architecture. And if you think about, let's say, not having them in a microservices system, you know already that you are blind, because when a problem arises, you don't know where to look at. You just have hunches. But there are certain tools that enables you even to plug themselves into the state management of a front-end application. And then when the problem arises, they are capable to replay the different steps that the user passed through in order to trigger that specific problem. So if you think just, let's say, a simple mechanism like this one can cut off the time for fixing a bug from hours to maybe minutes, or from days to hours. So as you can understand, those tools are incredible nowadays. I think all of them are suffering at the moment, or at least I'm not aware of any that is properly designed for distributed systems. So you need to work alongside with your provider in order to get, let's say, their approach for that. But I can tell you that back in the days, we were able to make Sentry working with the distributed system. We were talking about 2016, 2017. So I presume nowadays made some improvements out there. I've seen companies leveraging more and more, but I believe this is definitely one other dimension that you need to invest on. The last one on metrics that I think is extremely important are on the automation part, or the shift left movement, as I used to call it, where we need also to enforce certain characteristics in our system. One thing that is important when you are looking in a monolith is the budget size, or the size of your artifact. Now you don't have a single artifact anymore, you have multiple of them. Therefore, people often struggle with that, but there are some cool things that you can leverage. And what you can do is, I don't know, plugging into GitHooks some of these characteristics, and before, I don't know, making a PR or let's say committing some code, you can build on the fly the microfrontend, understand if the budget size is respected, and assigning even a threshold of leverage for discrepancy of the microfrontend size. And that will enable you to apply certain characteristics that very often, people don't think at all, because as an architect, we want to have certain capabilities expressed inside our system, but majority of the time without fitness functions where only, let's say, guesses or dreams that we wanted to have. But nowadays we can test certain of the things. I was doing recently a test with the TS Arch library that basically is a porting of Arc unit from Java. And the idea of this is that you can enforce certain characteristics. So I can write a test and say, this microfrontend can have only an external dependency that is the shared library or the design system, wherever it is. And I can test that the microfrontend doesn't retrieve other, let's say, external library from it. So as you can see now, I think there are 3 dimensions that we need to think about regarding data points that we need to gather in the microfrontends world. One is on the how to slice microfrontends, so how does the user behave. A second one is during the CI/CD cycle and the automation part, so expressing properly our architecture characteristics as well as providing certain guardrails to the team in order to behave properly. And finally, when the system is up and running. So when the system is in production and we want to understand where the bug or the issue is arising from. And those 3 dimensions obviously are completely, to a certain extent, new compared to monolith. And I think those are sometimes the struggle that people either don't think at the beginning or they are overlooking.
While listening to you, a naive question from backend mind came. So as mentioned, I start with the disclosure that I'm a backend guy, so I'm stepping on new territory. And I was just thinking that we are quite lucky on the backend side because the servers are in your house, let's say, whether it's in a public cloud or it's in your data center, you pretty much know what you're expecting and you have the ability of tweaking. While discussing for the front end, you're looking for a very heterogeneous environment because a big number, I don't remember exactly now the percentage, but I know that it's well above 50% of the traffic is coming from the mobile world, and there it's very complex. And then we're looking about different browsers, different screen sizes, and so on and so forth. How do you handle all that complexity? Because the problem is that on the front end, everybody's an expert. Everybody knows how big a button should be, how it should behave, or everything else. And that's scary from my point of view.
Yeah, so I think providing an experience that is common across multiple devices is becoming the standard for even for startups, to be honest. I've seen a lot of startups that are currently offering web and mobile and sometimes even other devices. And I think microfrontends can help on that because even on mobile, people might not know, but there are solutions like React Native with Repack, that is a library created by Netlify that enables you to use Webpack with React Native. And that means that Module Federation can be a first-class citizen inside your system. The beauty of this approach is that you can think about a mobile application as a group of views like you would do for a website. So if you're using React end-to-end from website to mobile, you can have a very interesting experience and potentially even thinking about have some part shared inside the specific vertical, ideally not across the entire application like we were used to do in the past. But if I'm responsible as a team of the UI part of a chunk of the system on web and mobile, better is likely that you can share certain part of the things. But then obviously if you have multiple teams working independently, you need to think slightly different. But that's something that we need to take into account. Now, for the UI part, I think it's important to leverage web standards in this case. So if you think about the design system, if you need to start from scratch, having web components definitely will help you to achieve your goal better because are compatible with any framework. And therefore, you don't have to reinvest time every time that you change framework for moving towards one direction or another one. And I think, very often we think that microfrontends can be a very scary approach because it will impact the performance. In reality, if you think about that, because you are lazy loading at runtime only the code needed for applying an action inside our system from our users, now you discover very quickly that there are some great benefit on performance thanks to microfrontends. Just to give you an example, vast majority of the time, in e-commerce or anything or subscription services that require a payment method, you have to integrate with multiple payment systems. So you have like maybe the SDK of Stripe, the SDK of PayPal, and many others. I work in this system was global, therefore I have a lot of SDKs to integrate. And thanks to Microfrontend, because we were lazy loading only what was needed, we were capable to load this SDK only when a user was signing up and reached the payment method, or if the user wants to change the payment method. But if you think about that in a monolith, you need to have them straight away. And on web specifically, it means that it will load your memory with a lot of stuff that won't be used for majority of the times. So this idea of distributed system, despite definitely we require a lot of more thoughts compared to, let's say, monolith, I believe that can provide incredible benefit, mobile, web, etc. And you can even, if you play well on your side, you can even think to share certain part of the application across devices without too much burden, to be honest.
Nice. And the other thing that I was thinking, you mentioned continuous deployment, you mentioned continuous integration. Well, with continuous integration, more or less, it's clear. Well, clearer. You just have your tests, they are continuously running. You have your fitness functions and all the tooling that are ensuring you that everything is happening. But then I'm just thinking that with continuous deployment, I would aim to have a gradual deployment, not go all in. So all these kind of mechanisms. But how would you look at that from the micro frontends? Is it more like, would you like to have, I don't know, I'm just saying now, a canary deploy where you're just looking at part of your fleet or of your ecosystem, or you're doing A/B testing, or both?
Yeah, that's absolutely valid question that I receive very often when a company became more mature on the microfrontend side. Because now you have like multiple independent artifacts. You can leverage canary release and blue green deployment like you would do for microservices. That is a practice that is consolidated over the last decade, I would say, or slightly more. And everyone is using that. So on the front end side, we are still working with Big Bang. And don't ask me why, because that was the first thing that I implemented when I was working in my previous company. Because I think it's a safe net for developers, right? So the moment that I can say, I want to deploy my microfrontend just to, 5% of my traffic, just in a specific browser and just in a specific country, then developers can test in production without affecting massively their system. Now, I think there is a place for canary release and blue-green deployment, as well as for feature flags in microfrontends. The challenge with feature flags that currently people are using on Monolith is that in a Monolith, you have your code base all in front of you, right? So you have control of everything. But in this case, you are responsible only on a portion of the system. And therefore, I think now you need to combine the two in order to have the best of both worlds. So by default, you don't have like feature flags every single time. And if you have a feature flag that's spun across the entire system, it becomes very complicated for microfrontend. So it's better that you rethink your strategy, because now you move a different piece. Otherwise, you need to coordinate massive teams that are not independent anymore. That sometimes is needed. I'm not saying no, but it's not always the thing. So you need to try to figure out the best way to use both. In my opinion, I tend to use more with microfrontends canary releases or blue-green deployment and have just specific things that I use for feature flags. And this approach honestly helped me a lot to de-risk the deployment of our system. In 2022, I worked with a group of people and maintainers of microfrontends frameworks like Zach Jackson and Joel Dunning and Matteo Figus, where we created basically a schema for doing canary release and blue-green deployment. And then they started to apply inside the frameworks. Nowadays, Pyral or Module Federation 2.0 and etc. have a system for doing exactly this. So have a mechanism for doing that. Even in AWS, working with Matteo, we created like an open source solution that you can deploy in AWS very quickly that enables you to notify through your CI/CD when there is a new microfrontends version and decide how you want to deploy. And this is mainly because if you think about that, is what we call in AWS undifferentiating heavy lifting. Now, once that you have created that, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. I've seen a lot of teams that started to create like integration inside the browser through plugins or a crazy JSON configuration for doing that. That's not really needed. I think there are better ways to do that. And yes, there will be a place where you want to rewrite the URL of specific things. And I know that there are solutions that are upcoming from the major vendors. But in reality, I believe that you need to start simple. Don't overcomplicate the process. Let's start with the bare minimum and then you start to add up slowly but steadily. I usually think about distributed system like living systems. It's not something that you design once and you forget about that. You need to nurture them. You need to work and slowly but steadily implement a tiny bit more to make your life easier or better or more performant or whatever is the metric that you want to move. And this approach for me is the right way for thinking about that. Software is not set in stone. It's something that you can evolve. And the only thing that we need to embrace in software is changing. And therefore, if you start from this mindset and you know that you can do a tiny bit better every sprint, then you probably arrive to have a very, let's say, complex, maybe safe net that will enable you to have multiple dimensions that you can tweak, but slowly but steadily. You don't have to go or in one go and then ask for the business, oh, we need to invest 6 months for building that. Do a first bit, do the things that are bare minimum, and then you start to iterate on top of that. You will discover that very often you are overthinking at the beginning. And when you start to have, let's say, more data points that prove that the direction of travel is correct, you will be in a better position to justify the investment to the business.
Thank you. That's quite insightful. But now that you opened another door, another question, so let's say that we do have the 24 months. I know we both know, everybody knows that it will not be the case, but we do have the chance of rebuilding everything from scratch. What will be the point? So how should we look at it? What will be the, let's say, milestones? Where we need to start with that part. That will be the other point, so that we don't think in terms of feature flags, but let's say milestones that are business-wise that make sense, but also from the technical perspective.
Okay, so how I would tackle is identify the first microfrontend. Okay, so it shouldn't be something too complicated, but not even something that, let's say, is too easy. You need to find a sweet spot that in a matter of a month or two, you are in production. Then I will divide the effort into one is rebuilding whatever framework, if you want to change framework or extracting the code from the existing application from a part of the team. And then the rest of the team should look into how routing works. And that will enable you to have a simple microfrontend that is extracted from the main application, taking care about the authentication, authorization, stuff like that. I will also create with an additional group of people or team the application shell, whatever is server-side or client-side rendering. So when you have one microfrontend, an application shell that is loading just that microfrontend, don't create like crazy complex logic for doing that. At runtime, obviously load it. And then you have a way for redirecting traffic between monolith and microfrontends application. You are in a good position to start with. Obviously, at the beginning, you need to find a way to either have time to create observability straight away or have a fast follow on that. So you have like a chunk of a system that you can operate, maybe not in the best way possible, because I didn't speak about kind of release or anything else. I'm just saying, do the first step and do it right and doing fast so you can learn from it. From that point on, the work streams start to be more interesting. So I will start to wait a bit before immediately start with the new microfrontend to gather information. What is working? What is not working? What we are missing? What is something that you would like to have immediately? And then start to divide and conquer. What part of the team will look into these missing parts of things that could make your life easier? And another part of the team will start to look into the next microfrontend. And if you start to tackle these things iteratively, you will discover that slowly but steadily, some stuff will arise. I remember vividly when we introduced the, let's say, the routing on the edge, and then we started to say, oh, okay, but if we have this, we can do kind of release, and we started to apply that. So the first release was just the routing, then we did kind of release. And then we did other stuff, like we realized that the developers need to have the possibility to tweak the application shell in a certain way to test their things. And therefore, we started to create a blueprint where for developers that they can have the latest version of the application shell with the JSON that was loaded at runtime baked into the application shell. So you can tweak it in the way that you want and start to iterate in the way that you want. And then from that, we started to look into the CI/CD, fitness function, and how to improve the performance of our application. And slowly but steadily, we add all the pieces that are needed. But if you start with, oh, we need to analyze everything before starting, you end up with an analysis paralysis that basically will fail miserably for moving forward. The main point, I believe, in this kind of system, because it enables you to iteratively deploy a small chunk of improvement every time, is moving. It's important that we move towards the right direction. And yes, it would be a bumpy journey because sometimes you make an assumption, but the result of your data that you gather after deploying is not maybe exactly what you're thinking about. And I believe it's fine because that's the point, is we're working on an empirical system. Software is not scientific, it's empirical. And therefore we need to work with trial and error. And errors is just part of the journey. It's not a negative thing how many people thinks about. It's just I need to do an error. So I test my assumption. The assumption was wrong. And I gather error to tell me how I can tweak these next tests in order to move towards the direction. I think this is the approach that I will take. And I've seen several companies successfully implemented that after the discussion we had. And then we tweak the direction of travel based on their findings.
Thank you. And you mentioned before, you in the beginning, you mentioned now companies that are having approaches. For the microservices world, there was Netflix. For a long period of time, Netflix was the Bible for everything. In case of microfrontends, are there any companies that have good public content in the technical blogs that are worth being looked at, used as inspiration?
There are a lot of case studies if you look into Medium from engineering blogs that are available there. Sometimes are in dev.to, if I remember well. So there are, let's say, a pocket of stories that you can find. Because I know that people are avid consumer of content, I started to do quite a lot of stuff around that because I believe that microfrontends very often are betrayed, mainly because people that maybe had like a bad experience or didn't have enough capacity for building them properly. So I started to create like few things. Like I have a video podcast that's called the Microfrontends in the Trenches that is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, where I basically interview people that are building microfrontends or framework maintainers or a company like Vercel in the previous season. And there I'm basically trying to surface these stories because I know some of them, but people maybe don't have the time or the will to write down their learnings. And I'm a huge fan of community and sharing these things. So I started that alongside also a Microfrontends newsletter that basically is a free resource that every other week I share free for information regarding Microfrontends that I believe is cool. I started from scratch last year. Now there are over 3,500 people subscribed. So it means that there is a community behind that wants to know more and more. I'm trying to push hard on creating content for Microfrontends. If you look in even on YouTube, you can find tons of talks about Microfrontends that I delivered, but also other people have delivered, because the community of, let's say, key people working on Microfrontends is not huge. We're talking about, I would say, a dozen of people, 20 top. But nowadays, it became contagious. Like when you have a company like Vercel, that I would say is probably at the forefront of front-end companies nowadays, that is starting to embrace Microfrontends, and they already have Microfrontends in their website and other things, and their customers as well, I think is huge. And AWS the same. If I see how many companies I spoke with in the last even 18 months, I don't know, the number of companies migrating to Microfrontends is doubling. And this is crazy because it means that we are starting to reach maturity and people start to see the value out of it. And I think it's a super exciting moment for Microfrontends, especially now with also the AI part that could help on the migration. I did some trials on helping company to migrate certain views from one framework, an old framework, to a modern framework. And you can cut the time of building views very quickly. And therefore, I believe there is no better time than now to think about migrating towards this system if the architecture makes sense for your context.
Okay, thank you. A lot of very useful insights. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that I should have asked you, but I missed?
No, I think it was a very interesting discussion on key points, and I believe microfrontends are becoming more popular as we speak. So I hope that this discussion will help other people to give a chance if they didn't try it yet. And for other people that are already practitioners, they might find some gems of information that could be helpful. The only thing I'm more than keen to offer to everyone that wants to have, like, say, some information about microfrontends, feel free to ping me on social, because as I said, I'm a big community fan, and you will see on my social that I'm trying to answer everyone, obviously compatible with my time. But I truly believe in this sharing approach, because I think it's the way how I grow as engineer first and then now as architect. And I truly hope that many other people will be able to reach other people out there, because there aren't too many people that have 10 years of experience on microfrontends and led the path on discovery these things. So I'm extremely keen to help others nowadays if you have specific questions.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. We had Luca Mezzalira sharing his knowledge about microfrontends. If you want to get more of that, he has a YouTube channel, he has a newsletter, he's working on a book that probably last quarter, if I remember correctly, it will be available.
It will be available at the end of November.
Okay, so it's a good present for Christmas if you want to gift yourself something. And thank you for your time, Luca.
Thank you for your time, and I hope that was insightful.
Thank you.